I am a liberal in the original sense. Now, obviously, if men are going to live in a society, there is no way in which you can have absolute freedom. There is a famous dictum of a Supreme Court justice that my freedom to move my fist is limited by the proximity of your chin. In a society in which there are many people, freedoms are bound to interfere one with the other. We are bound to have limits. And the question that we need to ask is what arrangements in a society will minimize coercion while preserving the maximum opportunity for members of a society to cooperate with one another to achieve their separate objectives. And I think in discussing that subject, the first thing you have to do is to emphasize the very different meanings that free has. There are two quite different meanings of free which tend to get confused and which it's important to keep separate. The first is freedom in the sense of the absence of coercion. That's the sense in which I shall be trying to use the term. The second is free in the sense of free lunch, in the sense of absence of cost. The two meanings are very different, and there are few more important sources of confusion about the proper role of government in our society than the confusion between the two very different meanings of the word free. When we speak about the right to free speech, as in the First Amendment of the Constitution, that's the meaning of the term in the sense of the absence of coercion. That says government shall make no laws that interfere with the freedom of speech. It means that people shall be free to speak voluntarily to one another. It's often forgotten that a corollary to freedom of speech is freedom to listen. Freedom of speech does not mean the right to force anybody to listen to what you have to say. Freedom of speech means the freedom to stand up and hire a hall and offer to speak and let anybody come who wants to listen to you. A very sharp contrast to that kind of freedom is the freedom that was suggested back in the days of World War II by Franklin Roosevelt when he spoke of the four freedoms and spoke of the freedom from want. That's a very different kind of freedom. How can you guarantee one person of freedom from want except by coercing another person to provide the material means for his being free from want? Freedom from want involves coercion. It may be a fine objective, but it uses the word freedom in an altogether different sense. So when I speak of a free society, I mean freedom in the first sense, absence of coercion. And by coercion, I mean very simply the use of physical force or threat of force to make one person the instrument or agent of another person's will. We often talk about people being coerced by opinion or by talk or by a TV program or by propaganda. Once you start down that line, I think you're in great trouble in preventing yourself from going very far indeed. Persuasion is one thing. Coercion is a very different. And by the freedom we mean the absence of the physical force or the threat of force to make one person serve another. Now obviously, if men are going to live in a society, there is no way in which you can have absolute freedom. In a society in which there are many people, freedoms are bound to interfere one with the other. We are bound to have limits. And the question that we need to ask is what arrangements in a society will minimize coercion while preserving the maximum opportunity for members of a society to cooperate with one another to achieve their separate objectives. The fundamental principle was stated by John Stuart Mill in On Liberty over 100 years ago. Quote, "The object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle, as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant." That's the fundamental principle that I am going to take as a given as describing my own values in trying to discuss the question of what government's role in a society dedicated to promoting freedom in that sense, what its role is. From this point of view, the nation state is a means to an end, not an end in itself. This notion that the individual, or rather in our society and every society, the family, is the basic unit. That we have responsible individuals or families cooperating one with another to achieve their objectives is in very, very sharp contrast to the notion that the fundamental unit is the state, that you have a nation state, and that the individual exists to serve the state. The right notion, from my point of view, is the other. The state, the government, is a means, an instrument through which we can jointly serve some of our ends, but it's not an end in itself. Patriotism may be a widely shared feeling because many of us feel a member of the same community. As we feel a member of the same family, we feel a member of the same smaller community and larger community. But that is a voluntarily shared consensus, and the state is not an end in itself. The ultimate unit is the individual or the family or such other voluntary groups as individuals may choose to participate in. And to a believer in a free society in this sense, the ideal is unanimity. The ideal is that you shall have joint action only insofar as people have been persuaded to act together. That you should have joint action only insofar as responsible individuals, after free and full discussion, have agreed jointly to cooperate in some venture. It's from this point of view that the market, voluntary exchange through buying and selling, is so important as a basis for a free society. The market has the enormous virtue that it enables you to achieve voluntary cooperation, to achieve unanimity without conformity. Everybody can do his own thing. Everybody can go to the store and buy what he wants to buy. If one man chooses to have a shirt of one color, he can have that shirt. Another man, a shirt of another color, he can have another color. Everyone can do his own thing within the limits of his resources. However, there are some items where it is not feasible for everybody to do his own thing. There are some cases in which you must have uniformity. Some cases in which the answer must be the same for all the people. The most obvious example is in the case of national defense. There is no way in which some people in a country can be engaged in an international war and other people in a country can be not engaged in that war. The decision whether the country is at war is a yes or no decision. that must be the same answer for all. Ideally, the ideal would be that we should not engage in such joint activities unless we have first achieved unanimity. But it is clear that that's not a feasible ideal. It is clear that you cannot, in a changing world, subject to problems that come up from time to time, that you cannot afford the time that would be required in order to get everybody jointly to agree on the same course of action. And hence, all of us who have lived in these kinds of societies, all societies of this kind, have been led to adopt something short of unanimity, a majority rule, as an expedient for reaching those kinds of decisions which require conformity. Let me stress that the majority rule in that context is not a principle, it's an expedient. People generally are inclined to equate democracy with majority rule. I believe that is a great mistake. There is nobody who believes in majority rule as an absolute. There is nobody who believes that if 51% of the people should vote to shoot the other 49%, that would make it okay. And our society in particular is erected on the notion that minorities have rights and not merely majorities. The Bill of Rights of our Constitution was an attempt to prescribe and assure in advance that majorities would not rule. And we are not willing to have a simple majority settle everything. For some purposes, a simple majority will do. If it's more important to reach a decision than it is what decision to reach, fine, a majority will do. But if it's something fundamental, for example, a foreign treaty, our Constitution requires a 2/3 vote. If it's something even more fundamental, such as changing our basic Constitution, well then we provide that you must have much more than a simple majority. You must have a qualified majority of the various states as well as of the Congress. So majority rule is an expedient which we have adopted in those cases where we need conformity. Now the reason why this is important is because the use of the political channel for deciding issues, while it is absolutely inevitable, while you must do it, inevitably tends to strain the social cohesion essential for a stable society. No society can be stable unless there is a basic, unthinking, unquestioning allegiance to certain common principles. You cannot possibly conduct a society, have agreement, unless that basic homogeneity and consensus exists. But every time you have to reach an agreement that requires conformity, when a majority votes and a minority must conform, you strain that social fabric, you strain that cohesion. As a result, the political mechanism does least harm to the stability of a society in those societies that are most homogeneous and that have the closest approach to common values. Government, you can use a political channel, you can use government decision, government-enforced conformity to a far greater extent in a country like Sweden, which has a highly homogeneous population with a very, very common set of values. You can go much farther than you can in a country where there is a wider variety of values, as in the United States. The experience of Great Britain is a dramatic illustration of this phenomenon. At one time, you had a much greater homogeneity of values, much greater cohesion in Britain than you have had in the past 10 or 20 years. And one of the sources of Britain's problems has been the attempt to use political mechanisms in a society that is getting increasingly diverse in its values and its beliefs, and where therefore there is a greater strain imposed upon that society. Why have we had an expansion in this country of ethnic divisions, of differences among subgroups in the country? We always prided ourselves on being a melting pot. That did not mean that we converted people to identical items, that we made one like another, but that we could live comfortably and conveniently with each group going its own way, with its own customs, and yet cooperating with one another on those areas which were of joint interest. But the more that we have turned to the political mechanism as a way to solve problems, to handle the allocation of resources, the more we have tended both to increase the advantage of ethnic isolation and to increase the frictions among the groups. So, if we are going to maintain a free society, especially in a society in which you have wide differences of customs and values and beliefs, it is essential that you rely as little as possible on the political mechanism and as much as possible on the market mechanism of voluntary cooperation, where each group can go its own way. The view I'm expressing is a view that classically has been termed liberalism. In the modern day and age, the word liberal has come to mean almost the opposite of what it used to mean. If you look at the dictionary, liberal means of and pertaining to freedom. If you look at behavior today, liberal means of and pertaining to freedom with other people's money. I am a liberal in the original sense, in the sense in which John Stuart Mill was a liberal, in the sense of which his statement was a statement of liberalism. And the liberal view that the justification for government action is to prevent coercion and to promote voluntary cooperation among responsible individuals leads to a very short list of basic functions which government should undertake. And I may say that short list is one which has a long intellectual history, coming from Adam Smith down through Adam Smith, and I should say Thomas Jefferson and the writers of the Declaration of Independence and the original Constitution, down through the philosophical radicals of the 19th century, Bentham and John Stuart Mill, down to the present. And these basic functions can be listed very simply. They are, first of all, to prevent one man from coercing another, the internal police function. They are, second, providing for external defense. These two are really part of the same: to prevent coercion from within, to prevent coercion from without. And beyond this, to promote voluntary cooperation among people by defining the terms under which we're going to cooperate together and by adjudicating disputes.